What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population. Because if where we are, there's nothing else.
As we make the world healthier, is the population going to get so big that feeding everybody and maintaining the environment is going to be impossible?
There have been prophets who've warned us of this impending disaster, of course. Thomas Malthus. Every one of these global problems, social as well as environmental, becomes more difficult and ultimately impossible to solve with ever more people.
Throughout my life, I always thought that we were in a overpopulation crisis. That is what I heard from my parents, the teachers, the media in general. One day, I randomly took an elective class at university. This class was demographics, which I thought was useful considering that I was studying economics. We were looking at WHO and UN datasets of populations and doing graphs on them, etc., looking at the prediction, all that good stuff. This is the moment I realized that I was lied to and that everyone was saying bullshit without even knowing it. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we are not in a overpopulation crisis, but rather soon to become a population collapse, led by the fertility rates plummeting everywhere on Earth. How did that happen? And why does a large portion of the population still believe that we are in a overpopulation crisis? You may not know about Paul Ehrlich, but he is one of the main reasons overpopulation became a mainstream thing. In his very accurate book, Population Bomb, he predicts the following. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in the 1970s and 1980s due to the overpopulation and resource scarcity, regardless of the measures taken. Very accurate. Or Ehrlich suggested that overpopulation would lead to the exhaustion of critical natural resources. Ehrlich also expected rapid and unchecked population growth to continue, leading to catastrophic consequences. Look at this astonishing 1970s interview of the super intelligent and visionary measures that Paul wanted to implement. It's pretty crazy.
Now, given the population explosion, let alone in this country, what ought the government to do about this?
So the first thing that should happen is that the president ought to say, from now, here on out, no intelligent, patriotic American family ought to have more than 2 children, preferably 1. He ought to make the FCC see to it that large families are always treated in a negative light on television wherever they appear. There ought to be a tremendous amount of television time devoted to spot commercials, the sort we've had against smoking. If that doesn't work, then you'll have the government legislating the size of the family.
Bro literally wanted to shame people for having children. Now, he was neo-Malthusian, and this is one of the first red flags, considering that every Malthusian prediction ever has been proven wrong for hundreds of years. For those who don't know, Malthus was an economist that falsely predicted that given the exponential growth of the population and the arithmetic growth of food production, humanity would repeatedly face crises of famine, diseases, and war unless population growth was under control. Bro forgot to implement technological advancement in his theories, but we can forgive him since in his time it wasn't really known. But Ehrlich is 92 at the moment, and he had 200 years to see why every Malthusian prediction turned out wrong and still choose to be Malthusian. That's why overpopulation became a big thing in the 70s and 80s. Moreover, in this time, China's population was skyrocketing and they implemented the one-child policy, which accentuated the whole culture fear of overpopulation. Basically, his ideas are still largely believed because people still reason in 1970s prediction and never got an update. Now we see Africa, and it's the same story all over again. Fear and population explosion, mediatization, etc, etc. Now let me tell you what is really going on, in my humble opinion. So, the economics of development is another class I took at uni, which was pretty interesting, and one of the most famous models in this field is the DTM, which isn't a new drug, but the demographic transition model, which is truly amazing. Okay, we're about to dive into some actual economics, so get ready, it's pretty cool. This is the graph I'm talking about. It looks a little bit overwhelming, but it's actually pretty simple. When a country goes through its economic transition from a pre-industrial to post-industrial economy, there is a 5-step process, which is the following. Just to clarify, the x-axis is time and the y-axis is birth/death rate. Stage 1. High birth rate and death rate keeps the population growth slow, pre-industrial revolution. Stage 2. Death rate drop, better healthcare and food, but birth rate stay high, causing rapid population growth. Birth rates stay high because too little time for cultural shift, whereas death rate are mechanistic. Stage 3. birth rate declines, education, contraception, and a slowing population growth. Stage 4, low birth rate and death rates stabilizing the population. And stage 5, which is our stage in the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, the birth rates fall below the death rate, causing population decline. Has this model worked? Yes, every time. Europe first with the US and Japan, then China in the early 2000s, India is about to enter stage 4, and Africa lastly is in early stage 3. So if you take the actual data of the UN, we see that basically population peaks in the 2080s and then decreases. I think the low UN scenario is probably the most realistic with what we see in the past decades. And remember, this is for the entire world, but if we look at countries that developed earlier like Japan, basically the demographic future of the world, it looks like this: a drastic decrease in population. Europe is approximately on the same trajectory with a few years delay, and the same goes for the US. And you could say, yes, that's why we need immigration. This is just delaying the problem, since immigrant will also follow the same birth rate to national average after 1 to 2 generations. So this is a false solution, it's just delaying the problem. So all of that is pretty cool, right? But why is it a problem? Maybe we'll lose a few billion people and stabilize at, let's say, 7 billion. Right? Well, no, my friends, because something scary happens when the birth rate is below the replacement rate of 2.1 child per woman, and it's called exponential decay. Now, stick around for this one because it might change your outlook on the future. I'm not kidding. Let's take a scenario in the not too distant future where the global birth rate is 1.5, which is more than Japan has, and the replacement rate stays at 2.1. A generation is, let's say, 30 years, and the starting population is 10 billion humans. What happens? Well, after only 4 generations, the world population collapses to only 3.2 billion, bro. This is due to exponential decay. So we could kinda go instinct by not making enough babies. Now, this is highly simplified, doesn't account for wars, plagues, or anything, but it could even be worse than this if the birth rate goes under 1.5, which is not crazy. The consequences of such scenario are pretty crazy, like economic collapse, skyrocketing dependency ratio, a disproportionate share of seniors versus working age adults that can strain the government budgets and make pension system unsustainable, infrastructure decay, unmanageable healthcare costs, less innovation, etc, etc. And even if AGI happens and robots basically take charge of the economy, it's still less consciousness and humans. That's sad in itself. Because we should be a growing and expanding civilization, not reach our peak now, come on. So we've seen that we're actually going straight to a population collapse and that immigration is not a long-term solution, and the dramatic effects that all of that will have on our civilization. What can we do? Well, having more children, of course, a lot, but this won't happen, of course, because as we saw, the numbers are pretty crazy. Across wealthier nations with widespread polling, 10 to 40% of childless adults say climate, environment, overpopulation, fear play some role into the decision to delay or avoid having kids. If we take into account that Gen Z is poorer and pessimistic over the future, there is a very low chance that the birth rate will increase in the near future. And even if it's pessimistic to some extent, by knowing that we can act. Thanks you all for watching, and never trust Paul Ehrlich. Never be a Malthusian, because one must trust in human ingenuity, and of course, most importantly, subscribe.